I'd like to begin by welcoming members and officers and those members of the public watching via YouTube. County Council allows filming and photography at its public meetings, so please feel free to take pictures and tweet during the meeting. Can I ask, though, that everyone present turns their mobile phones to silent or vibrate whilst the meeting is taking place. There is no fire alarm test scheduled for today, so if the alarm sounds, I will adjourn the meeting. We will all make our way downstairs. The muster point is in the car park to the rear of the building. The meeting room has been arranged to comply with public health guidance on COVID safety. In line with their latest advice, committee members and officers are asked to wear face coverings when they're moving around the building. Before we start the business of the meeting, I would like to ask the Head of Pensions, Mark Whitby, to give a short statement in relation to the current situation in Ukraine.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, with the human tragedy unfolding, it's obviously quite difficult to talk about a pension fund, but I did think it'd be useful just to talk about how that's impacted, particularly the assets and a few other matters before we start. The Cambridgeshire Fund only had about £3.3 million invested directly in Russia. To put that into context, the last formal reported valuation of the fund was 4.3 billion at the end of December, and so that's about 0.08% of assets. That really consisted of just one single stock holding within our actively managed funds. That was a domestic retailer in the Dodge and Cox fund. And then some other sort of instances. That was about 2.2 million. Then a few other isolated holdings primarily through our private equity. So very, very small amounts. I think it's useful just to say what's happening from this point with those holdings. So in terms of passive equity, Russia has been removed from all indices now. So if there are any instances that did exist, they'll be effectively being held and will be disposed of, if possible, in an orderly manner once the market's open. And then obviously those, any amounts will accrue to the respective funds. Obviously across the active funds, those assets are being held at nil value at the moment. So in terms of where we are in terms of by the end of February, which is the last time we've got any real numbers. So it was 4.3 billion at the end of March. It was 4.2 billion at the end of February. And I think that is actually accurately reflecting particularly the listed and passive values. And I know I was just looking at how the markets have moved since then. And actually some of the indices are higher than they were at the end of February as of yesterday, and others are broadly the same. So there hasn't been huge fluctuations in the market since then. Obviously, some of our funds are held in active assets, so they can differ. The other thing or just a couple of other points I'd just like to pick up on, in terms of obviously the cyber and the security risk, we have got a paper coming later where Joe will be talking through the discussions we've had with some of our main suppliers in terms of the increased cyber risk. And of course, the other side of the financial aspect, so you've got the assets, the other side is the liabilities. Douglas from Hymans is here today. And again, in a private paper, he'll talk about how the approach to the valuation means that shocks like this can be managed and the impact smoothed over time. So again, those couple of issues will be talked through later. But I thought that might be useful just to put in terms of the pension fund, the impact in context. I guess the only final thing I could say is that obviously there are indirect exposures. So companies that are domiciled in UK, in the US, will have some of their income come through the Russian markets. I would say that actually the impact of that is probably already flowing through to the market prices. And you've seen that with companies like Shell, where they took a hit when they tried to remove themselves from certain investments in Russia. I'm happy to take any questions on that.
Thank you, Mark. Got no points on there. I think we're all somewhat probably still in a little bit of shock at what is actually happening in the world at the moment. And we no doubt want to send our best wishes to all of those people in Ukraine and hope that this is over very shortly. Did you?
Thank you, Chair. Mark, if I could just ask a question about a bit of the imponderable about, we have a number of investments in a number of places, and those companies might also have other investments, and any investments within Russia are going to be somewhat difficult to identify as you go further away from the initial source. So are you confident that that will become more available and understandable as we go on, or is there always going to be that likelihood? For example, in gas trading, we know that even if you try to disinvest, there's still going to be something like 4% of Russian gas that will be in the marketplace that will be difficult to fully identify. I wondered if it was a similar situation in terms of pension investments.
Yeah, I mean, I think the direct exposures are well known. It's the indirect exposures which are harder to quantify, and actually, I think certain managers can do it more easily than others. So I think, for example, J.O. Hambro is one who has quite a detailed handle on where their incomes are coming from. And so, for example, they could quantify, if you like, the amount of Belarusian income they were getting. Link have been very useful in terms of the asset pool in giving instruction to all managers within the asset pool as to how to treat the particular assets. But this, as you quite rightly say, over time, I think this is going to more and more detail will emerge. But I think in terms of the indirect, I think, as I said, the fair pricing is sort of settling and has done over recent weeks. So I was talking about the end of February. I think since then we've seen more, movements in values and understanding flowing through. I guess the bigger question is, after Russia, are there any other markets where there might be impacts? And I was just talking before the meeting about, somewhere like China, for example, where, it's far more embedded in value chains and what have you. This is, I think Russia was more easy to isolate in a sense.
Thank you. If there's no other comments. Dawn, do we have any apologies?
No, Chair. We've got Councillor Schumann arriving late, and I haven't heard from Councillor Bowden.
Thank you. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest?
Thank you, Chair. I'm a beneficiary of a residual pension from the scheme.
Thank you. John?
John Walker. I am a retired member of the fund. Son and daughter-in-law are both deferred members.
Thank you.
Sorry, Chair. Matthew Pink, I'm an active member of the fund and my wife's an active member too.
Thank you. Yes, that's everyone. Item 2 then, we're being asked to approve the minutes of the Pension Fund Committee meeting on 13th of December 2021 as an accurate record. Can I ask if any member who does not agree with this proposal to raise their hand now? I see no objection to the proposal to approve the minutes as an accurate record. That's carried unanimously. Turning to the action log, do officers have any comments or updates? No. Members, any questions on the action log? Okay. We're asked to note the action log, and I assume we're happy to do so. Thank you. Item 3 is petitions and public questions. We have no petitions or public questions. Let's move on to item 4, which is the administration performance report. I believe Joe is joining us remotely. Yes? Ah, there you are. Can I hand over to Joe Kent, Governance and Regulations Manager, then to present this report?
Thank you very much. I'll just run through the report in order. So to start with, we have the key performance indicators that are detailed in Appendix 1. For the period 1st of October 21 to 31st of January 22, all key performance indicators have met the green target, so green performance, so that's all good. The next section of the report is the receipt of employee and employer contributions. We're running at an average of 99.5% of employers paying their contributions on time. There's a private appendix detailing the employers that did pay late. If anybody wants to discuss anything about those, we will need to go into private session. Next item on the report is breaches of the law, and this also links into the next section on internal dispute resolution procedure cases. So I'll skip to section 5 for that. So I have a couple of updates on the internal dispute resolution procedure cases, largely because we've had a little problem with the process at stage 2. The responses are taking a little bit longer for the monitoring officer to deal with at the moment, because the work is outsourced to Pathfinder, and their key member of staff that dealt with these responses has been unwell and not working. So some of these responses have dragged on quite some time, as you can see from the table on page 19. Where we are with this now, we have had to report this as a breach of the law, because at certain points during these members waiting for responses, they weren't provided with a letter to tell them that the deadline had been extended, which is required under the regulations. So that is why we've needed to report them as a breach of the law in section 4.2 of the report. By way of an update, I can advise that on page 19, the first 2 stage 2 cases, they now have a new deadline of the 12th of April for the monitoring officer to respond by, and members have been advised of that. I can also advise that the third one down on that list, on that table, has now been responded to in full and partially upheld. The fourth on that list is at stage 1, so with the head of pensions, and we are needing to obtain more information before we can respond to that. So we've extended the deadline on that one. And then the only update on that table is actually in 5.4, the second table on that page, where the monitoring officer has responded to that case in full and partially upheld the appeal. So that is actually all of the items I wanted to discuss in the report, and happy to take any questions if there are any.
Members, any questions you wish to raise? Edna.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions, in fact. One about the KPIs and the other about the employers, the sort of uptick in employers paying late. In terms of the KPIs, yes, they are all green and they've all hit above the sort of minimum acceptable target. But there are, I suppose I'm really asking if, some of these things are quite important for individuals, not paying benefits from active employment. So any one that is missed should be a matter of concern. So I wonder if, even though these are green in the sense of meeting the KPIs, do they nonetheless, just for my reassurance, do they nonetheless trigger some investigation about what the circumstances were that led to it? Obviously, if you don't meet the KPI, then it's there's a systemic problem, but I just wonder if individual cases are investigated.
Sorry, I'll start, and Mark might want to follow up on that. in the reporting period, we dealt with, for that example, approximately 200 retirements from active, and only 3 of those were dealt with after the target time period. There is a close eye kept on these, and regular reports run daily on what cases are approaching the time that we need to process them. So there are lots of safeguards in place. Without looking at these 3 cases in particular, I don't know off the top of my head what the issues were surrounding those. Mark, do you have anything further to add to that?
No, I mean, we're so for retirements from active status, we're aiming for a continuity of income. So if someone was receiving a wage in 1 month, we want them to get their pension the next. And that's absolutely what we're always trying to achieve. Generally, when we miss, it's things like it was calculated, but there was an error in the calculation. It's gone back, and that kind of thing, as opposed to anything more systemic. It's usually individual error with the calculator or the checker in terms of breakdown of the process. I mean, I think our bigger concerns, if I'm, around the retirement process, for example, is how long it takes us to get information from an employer to actually do our bit of a job in the first place. So that's usually more of the concern than a failure at our end, which is usually quite isolated.
Thank you. And if I may ask the second part of my question, I have to say that's very reassuring. I just wanted to make sure that there was, underneath these figures, there were responsive actions in relation to the misses, as it were. In relation to the employers paying late, there seems to have been an uptick over the months indicated, and perhaps there is a link between employers paying late and ultimate failure to pay, which is features highly on our risk register. So I wonder if you also see that there is an uptick, B, what the reasons are they just isolated, or are there trends, and C, is there any implication then for the risk register?
Jo, could I ask for you to respond to that initially?
Thank you. Yes. Without mentioning names, of course, because we're not in private session, on Appendix 3, you can see that there was, in the reporting period, some consistent names on the report, some consistent employers, which is added to the statistics are quite not at 100%. I don't think there is a systemic problem with these particular employers, but where we have, it could, Corey will verify this for me because he might have more information on this, but the particular employers that are featuring on this list are probably all dealt with at the same location by the same human, and the failing has resulted because of that. And I don't think it's a wider problem than perhaps just at this individual employer level, where they haven't done what they've needed to in the time frame that we needed to do it. The risk, again, I think it's still appropriately graded on our risk register. The values of these employers, whilst it's important to the scheme employer and to the members concerned, overall to the fund, it doesn't have that greater impact. So those would be my initial comments. Mark or Corey, do you want to follow up with anything on that?
Yes, my understanding is, as Jo was saying, that this was a particular payroll provider with those employers. It's one company providing cleaning services to a number of our scheme employers. And I believe it was an isolated problem for those 2 months. But what Jo has said is correct. There is no direct link between the contributions coming in from the employer and what we pay out. But we do follow that up. We've got an escalation process in place, and that has been working quite well, other than these isolated cases.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? No? In which case we're actually asked to note the administration performance report. Are we happy to do so? Thank you. Okay. Item 5 is the Pension Fund Annual Business Plan Update Report for 2021-2022. Can I ask Mark Whitby, Head of Pensions, to present this report?
Okay, thank you, Chair. I won't go into a huge amount of detail because we've got the new business plan coming as the next agenda item, which picks up a number of these. So probably if I turn to page 49 of the pack, which is the table of all of the various activities in summary form, and just work our way down that. And then, as I say, happy to take any questions. So really just trying to give you the end of year position. So I'm working way down from the top. We also had a couple of procurements that we completed during the year at the top. The actuarial benefits governance and the software one and the legal one were all primarily future activity. Although I do note on the recommendations, as part of a new business plan, we are looking to sequence all of our contract, or sorry, all of our procurements in a sensible manner. And so there is just a couple of things just to get that right, which I'd be grateful if you could approve today, those recommendations. I should say, as I said before, we are happy with all of our suppliers. And so any extensions or non-extensions are purely around doing things in a logical timeframe. Working way down from there, we completed work on the business plan. The cyber resilience we're talking about later, but that's progressed very well this scheme year. HASA, we're actually, because it was a future activity, but we're not putting it in the medium-term business plan because we do see that we have an awful lot of work going forward with the government initiatives around the cloud, good governance, the work we're doing around RI. There's a huge list of activities we're looking to get through, so we're not looking to do that in the medium term, so it doesn't carry over. The next couple we have progressed as best we could. So there were delays in the code of practice, so we weren't able to do anything this financial year. The GMP project continues over as we expected it to. McLeod age discrimination remedy is also carrying over into the future year. This year and the beginning of the next scheme year continues to be around getting data in from scheme employers. The valuation project is obviously was there with certain activities will carry over. The undecided levers is the one where I think we need to make serious inroads next year. I think I've got the resource in right now. So I have, as it says in the detail, put in place some additional resource, both in a business as usual team and in a project team to try to get that activity up and running. We've been broadly stable across the year. I think now we should be able to knock off to about 2,500 cases a year, as long as we can keep the resource up. The problem, and you've seen from the KPIs that they're green across the board. The problem has been is that we have been recruiting and there's been some internal movements to that project team, but I've had to hold those people back whilst we backfill the teams from which they've come in order to keep the KPIs green. And so there's an impact between our KPIs and that project activity. But I think we're just about there now on resourcing. In the pre-meeting with the chair and vice chair, I did mention that whilst we're getting people in, it sometimes is taking more than one recruitment campaign to actually get staff in at the moment. It's a very, very competitive market. The next one is scope and conduct potential liability reduction exercises. Actually, we haven't got that in the business plan, but that is almost a nice to have that we're doing in the background. So we'll continue to work on, but I don't think it's a discrete activity that there is any need for us to report to the committee. In essence, this is chasing people who haven't claimed refunds in the main. And so I will prioritise paying benefits, awarding benefits over chasing people who haven't responded. And then just continuing down this list, the employer covenant monitoring was concluded. The access development obviously is continuing to plan. Huge amounts of work on the RI policy, and you've seen the results of that. And then the property strategy is we did get an agreement with the chair to delay that into the next financial year. And the investment subcommittee have already seen the fruits of the revised benchmarks and revised quarterly performance reporting at the end. So those are the activities. The final thing I would say is around the financials on the next page. Obviously, the big number that we don't know what it will be is what the value of the fund will be at the 31st of March, which I'm not going to predict, even though it's a few days away. But the bit which is clearly under our control is the expenses, and you will see the variance the projected variance is very, very tiny for the scale of the budget on page 53 of the pack. So the admin expenses, we're looking at a 2k variance on a £2.5 million budget at the moment. And you'll see there that we've had an underspend due to some vacancy factor on staffing, and then some of the additional software that we actually put in place for improved reporting actually offset some of that saving. But other than that, I'm happy to take any questions on the activities or the funding.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Members, any questions, comments on there?
Thank you, Chair. I've got two, if I may. The first one is about PASA. Forgive me, I don't really understand what the benefits are and why we put it off, how much it costs, whether anything's statutory. I just wondered if you could explain it for me, please.
Yeah, so we've been doing customer service excellence accreditation for a number of years, which we undertook to effectively improve customer journeys, and it was a useful exercise to identify where we could improve and put in place changes. And actually now we think we're at the point where continuing that is no point. PASA was an alternative accreditation that some funds have. In an ideal world, we'd have the time and capacity to go through that. It could potentially bring benefits, as any accreditation process can, when you look at your processes and the way you do things. But to a certain extent, I think we've already gone through part of that. Since we put it in, and it was put in as sort of like a medium-term objective, I would say the environment has changed to the extent that, particularly with the clashes of things like the pension dashboard, the McLeod age discrimination remedy, and just the sheer amount of procurements we've got next year, over the next few years. And one of them is incredibly major, which is the software supplier. If we change software supplier, it would take us a year to rewrite every single business process we've got, put in place a new payroll system. So for that reason, I didn't want to put it in there, because I felt we'd probably just end up delaying it again and again.
Thank you. It seems eminently sensible when you've got such a massive change coming on board. My other question was on the financials. It's just really a question about the item under expenses and the 489,000 at County Council overhead recovery. I just wondered if you could explain that for me.
Yes, so the overhead the overheads are effectively all the back office systems, like the ERP system. It actually also includes payroll staff, and the actual physical issuing of pay slips and things like that. It includes the IT infrastructure. So it includes accommodation. So it's everything that the West Northamptonshire Council, or occasionally Cambridgeshire County Council, provide to the fund for its administration. And it's obviously a single cost which is split between the Northamptonshire Fund and the Cambridgeshire Fund. A lot of it is obviously from the West Northamptonshire space because that's where we reside. But there are costs like, for example, the support which the Section 151 officer provides to the funds as well.
Thank you. So it's effectively a pandemic impact that you haven't had to use all that facility?
Well, the accommodation charge is still being there because you know, the building is still there and still being paid for. But I mean, the accommodation charge will clearly, I should say actually, there is an ambition to look at line by line what that is going to be. We've looked at a couple of lines in a new business plan, but it's not been looked at holistically line by line for many years. In fact, it stayed the same for a number of years. So that exercise, I think, will perhaps be undertaken for 23-24 year.
I'm grateful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments or questions? Nothing. Thank you. Well, the committee has asked to note the business plan update to the end of the financial year. Secondly, to approve the extension of the benefits and governance contract by a period of 6 months, paragraph 3.3.3 of the report. And 3, to approve the extension of the specialist legal services contract by a period of 12 months, paragraph 4.1.3 of the report. Are we happy to do so? Thank you. Okay, so item 6 is the Pension Fund Annual Business Plan and Medium-Term Strategy for 2022-23 to 2024-25. Can I ask Mark to present this report?
Thank you, Chair. And I won't repeat myself around any of the activities because, as you've seen, a number of them carry over, as we just discussed. Actually, we have, I hope, made the activities a bit more clear in terms of how they're laid out. So Joe's team in particular have spent an awful lot of work trying to improve this. I guess in terms of the activities that weren't there before, certainly the pension dashboard is one that I would flag as being of a little bit of concern at the moment in terms of the timing of this, because it appears that it may come in around about the time that we're still trying to deal with the McLeod remedy. And the pension dashboard is, in itself, is obviously a fantastic idea. This is where data is going to be provided by pension funds to a central place whereby it can be collated, and then people can see the entirety of what they have in terms of pension. I think there'll be a very systemic way of providing that. It's if there are any queries, it's dealing with those queries or the missing data, which is going to be the hardest thing for a pension fund, particularly with the complexity of the Lgps. So that's obviously one of the main activities that we've added, which wasn't there before. In terms of what else the business plan sets out, I have included the structure of the service and would flag that I have made some adjustments to that structure. In particular, we've previously had an investments and a separate account, fund account manager reporting directly into myself. I have merged those two roles as Richard Perry is retiring at the end of March. And we used to have those roles merged, they've been re-merged, so that's happening. But at the same time, I've created a systems and projects role to give us greater ability to manage the projects that are coming down the line over the coming years in particular. And it's also moving some activity away from Jo, so she can concentrate more on all the governance activity that's also coming down the line over the coming years. So I think it's quite an important change. It's just rejigging my direct reports and therefore how the functions work within a service. The other thing in particular I wanted to flag was on, and I will have to scroll to it myself, on the financials, because if you review on page 69 of the pack, the admin expenses or rather, sorry, the management expenses, what you will note is, particularly on the governance expenses line, it goes from about 700k in 21-22, jumping to 900k in 22-23, and down to back down to about 750 in 23-24. That's all Douglas's fault in terms of the fund actuary. It's the evaluation year, so therefore we have huge. Obviously, it's the most significant actuarial activity that there is, that happens obviously every 3 years. And so we do make an allowance of 100k plus within the budget for that activity. So that may have stuck out to you, which is why I've just mentioned that. In terms of that, I think other increases are quite sensible. We've put a few extra staff in, but I don't think that has a huge impact on the budget relative to the size of the fund. I'll leave it there really and ask whether there's any questions on any of that.
Members, any questions? Josh.
Thank you, Chair. And start by saying apologies for my late arrival. Mark, I understand the increase in the governance expense. You've just explained that. Thank you. 200,000 between 21-22 and 22-23. The total administration expense, though, increases quite significantly by about 140,000, but then in subsequent years only by 20,000. So is that associated with the actuary's work as well, or is there a different explanation for that?
No, we've added a few extra staff. I mean, that's when I say that, that's for both funds, and then obviously only half of it flows through to this fund. In terms of the staff budget, what we report here is actually different from what you would normally corporate report. So we set a budget at the beginning of the year, look to see what the pay increases may be. But then if greater increases flow through, we report a greater variance. So we're actually reporting from a baseline that doesn't move. So what's happened is, in the current year, I've added extra posts into the establishment, but we've had a vacancy factor higher than what I'd expect. So the vacancy factor I allow for in the budget was five staff. If I've got 80-ish full-time equivalents across the two funds, I'm expecting a vacancy factor of about at least 5 at any given point in time. I've increased our vacancy factor slightly here in this budget, but if we have that establishment in, it will be those numbers there. So that's the reason for the differential between current year and the next year. The increase after that is just inflationary increases. So that's why there's a bigger gap from where we've been to where it is predicted to be in the business plan year.
Thank you. And if I may, Chair, then a subsequent question, looking at the KPIs and the fairly impressive position that the fund finds itself in administratively, does that ask a question about whether the staffing structure is correct and whether we actually can operate a slightly different staffing structure?
Well, the staffing, I've been informally running the structure that I'm looking to formally put in place for most of the last year. So effectively, I've had someone acting up into a projects and systems role, and I'm going through the formal process of recruiting that role right now. And that was done in order to deliver what we needed to do, in the current scheme year just ending. What I do always is effectively look at what I believe the resources required are to deliver the medium-term financial plan. And I believe that what is there is what's needed, particularly because, as I've already explained, there's been a bit of an inability to deal with some of the project work in order to keep and sustain the business as usual.
Edna, I think you were.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm back on the risk register. it's in the context of this is obviously very well managed, performing well. And so it's really just trying to dig a little bit about, what the risks are for the future. And the number one risk is about employers unable to pay increased contribution rates. Can you give examples of the kind of events that would lead to that? Because what I'm concerned about is that if there's an event or a situation that leads to that, it might also impact on other elements of the risk register. There might be sort of a common cause for impacting different, and it might, with one event, it might be that this risk register looks rather different. So I wonder if you wanted to comment. It helps me to understand any concrete events that might happen.
If I say something, Corey, and then you come in, because I guess my comment around that risk is it's one of the hardest risks to actually put a number to, because the reality is that the likelihood of an employer not paying, it's usually likely to be a very, very small body that has an immaterial effect on the fund. However, there is a possibility that a larger employer couldn't pay in a very extreme scenario, and that would have a far greater impact. So it's always a very, very hard risk to score. But we've never really had an issue with, let's say, a local authority not being able to pay their contributions. And in theory, and going back to the way the fund actually treats those employers, they can raise the tax raising bodies and could raise enough to pay it in theory. But that's I guess that's my comments around that risk. So we don't really see it as having a likelihood of the largest of employers ever being in that position.
Thank you. But yeah, if I can just add to that, we do have a number of mitigations in place to help with this. The idea behind this risk is that the highest point of risk is following the valuation year, when contribution rates change. And if there has to be an increase in contribution rates because of the conditions at the time, that's where that risk becomes the greatest. But we have a consultation period with employers when we're working through that. So we produce the original results. We then discuss those with employers about affordability and try to work out a payment plan if we can. So that might involve taking security from an employer to relax that, for example. The other thing is shocks that are unexpected, COVID being the biggest one that we looked at recently. I contacted a lot of the employers that I thought were the highest risk of that. So small charities, contractors who rely on schools being open, things like that, and had a lot of dialogue with those. And actually, we only had 3 employers across both funds look to take payment holidays. One of those didn't take that forward in the end. So they had that robustness in the system. And we did flex some contributions or reprofile them in certain ways to help with that. And we've done the employer covenant monitoring exercise as well for our risky employers. So that involved taking a deep dive into their finances. PwC gave us some ratings for the risk on that, and we're in the process of having dialogue with those employers about affordability of contributions. The positive thing that I can say from that is most have come back and said that if contribution rates are maintained at current levels, then they remain affordable, and they're not foreseeing any affordability problems at the moment. So it's looking very positive on that risk, and as I say, we have these processes to mitigate against it.
So I mean, that's very reassuring, but I just wanted to offer a bit of challenge to the, I appreciate it is really difficult to think what are the circumstances in which there would be quite a widespread inability to pay. But I think it is worth actually trying to think what those events are. If there's a lot of public funded bodies, maybe public funding is not going to be available. That could be one instance, which in a sense, in our current circumstances is somewhat unthinkable, but it's not impossible. So I think it would be helpful to try to home in on 1 or 2 things that would make a difference and then, would make an impact. So then you could think, how likely is that thing that is going to happen? And it could be very unlikely indeed. But I think it's worth just going there, even if it does seem a little bit far-fetched what those examples are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions around the expenses. I think it might be helpful if we could see a table with percentages as well to give an indication of how much each of those line items are going up. But if my quick calculations right, it looks like the staff related is going up about 2% a year, which I presume is an anticipated payroll increase, but the overhead recovery is more like 5% a year. I was just wondering what the difference was there.
Yes, the biggest driver of the change in the overhead recoveries, I did mention in passing about the fact that there needs to be a line by line appraisal of the overheads, because that's not happened for, gosh, 7-8 years plus. However, a couple of lines were looked at, and the one where we were significantly underpaying was for the ERP system. So our costs for the ERP system were really quite low. And so there's been a look at what those costs should be. And so that was the biggest change. But so what that means is that line is now probably set correctly going forward, but hadn't been in the past. I would say we are significantly below what we used to pay a number of years back for overheads, by some margin. When I first took over, I got them to just completely look at it again, and we came out considerably below where we were. It has been pretty static for the last 5 years or so. But there was we did try to get a line by line appraisal for this year, but we just weren't able to do it. So the reason for that is principally the increased cost of the ERP system. But I mean, I looked at it with a Section 151 officer, and we believe it's probably a fair rate to pay.
So I think it was more looking at the 23, 24 and 24, 25 that the percentage increase for those years.
That is, I think it's fair to say that may change significantly in any direction, depending on the outcome of the appraisal. So we must remember there is a new entity which is effectively feeding in those corporate costs. They need to take time to obviously look at what those costs should be, but they obviously it will be in discussion with the Section 151 of both pension funds. So Tom Kelly and Martin Henry will look at those numbers and make sure they are fair to the pension funds, and then they will be proposed obviously to you as a committee, probably at this time in a year's time. But yeah, at the moment we've if you like corrected it for 23, 24 to what it probably should have been for some time in the past, but we've just put a small uplift for future years, but they will be looked at.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments, members? No? Okay. So the committee is asked to approve the business plan and medium-term strategy. Are we all happy to do so? Okay, thank you very much. So item 7 is the governance and compliance report. And can we return to Joe Kent to present this report, please? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just quickly run through some of the items. I'm sure you've all read the report. So to start with, we have in section 2 of the report the latest statistics from the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities on the LGPS as a whole. So for the 85 funds that are in England and Wales. Within that, a paragraph in the report that details the headline statistics on total expenditure, total LGPS income, And an interesting statistic here, I suppose, is the market value of the 85 Lgps funds as at the end of March 2021 was £337.1 billion. That was an increase of 23.8% on the previous year. So that's quite a significant amount of money within the Lgps. Running through the rest of the report, just to advise you that we, where are we, sorry. The significant impact that we thing that occurred in the last couple of weeks was the decision for scheme member representation within Access, which wasn't there previously, that we were under, or the Access pool was under some pressure to put in place. That has now finally been agreed, and 2 LPB members from the 11 funds will rotate as observers on the joint committee when the next meeting happens. So that's good news that we've satisfied the scheme advisory board on that one. Then the other things I wanted to mention really were the new legislation that is coming in or due to come in. That the first bit of new legislation in 2.4.1 concerns transfers and making it slightly more difficult for members to transfer out in certain circumstances. It's quite technical, so I won't go into too much detail on that. But it is helping us to prevent pension scams, which is becoming a bit of a growing theme within the pensions industry. But fortunately, as a fund, we've not really suffered from any of that yet. We've had a couple of, well, one case that we've been looking at, which is featured in the admin report. That's been going on for several years, but that has reached no conclusion yet on whether that was, we would need to reimburse on that one or not. So as a fund, we've been lucky, and these extra sets of regulations will also help us avoid any of that. The only other thing I probably want to mention is skills and knowledge. As you'll be aware, the Aon training modules that were around last summer were recorded. They are due to come offline on the 31st of March, which is next week. If you haven't already done your training on those modules, I'd be really grateful if you could do that by the 31st of March. And if you have any problems with that training, could you let us know? And we'll shortly be sending around some information on what training you've undertaken as well, just so that you're up to date and you know where you are with it all. That's really all I wanted to point out from the report. So happy to take any questions.
Members, any questions on the report? Can't see any hands. If I could just urge anyone who hasn't completed the training to do so, that would be appreciated. Thank you, Joe. Okay, so the committee is asked to note the contents of this report. Are we happy to do so? Thank you. Right, item 8 is the Cambridgeshire Pension Fund Anti-Fraud and Corruption Policy Review. Can I ask Michelle Oakenson, the Governance Officer, to present this report?
Thank you. So this policy first came into force in October 2017, and we're now on the second review of this policy. As with any policy, it's always good practice to revisit them and make sure they remain fit for purpose at any given time. So just to draw your attention really to section 3.1 of the main report, the actual policy itself is in appendix 1. In section 3.1, it highlights the changes that we want to make to the policy to make it a bit more robust going forward. As you will see there, I'll just pull out a couple of the things that we've identified upon this review and the thought behind it. So obviously the first item on there is to include officers into this particular policy as well. Previously, we always had a members policy and officers were in the corporate policy. But after reflection upon this one, it seemed actually more prudent to have those two policies running in conjunction with each other, because there are things in this policy that does covers officers as well. The rest of the detail really is under section 10 of the actual policy. And it's the detection and prevention of fraud table that we provide, where it details the activities that we undertake. So previously it was just all under activity, but on reflection this time, it actually makes more sense to have the activities and the triggers. So for example, the activities that we may undertake are the things that we routinely do to make sure that we're not subject to any fraud where we can be. So something such as the monthly mortality screening, for example, we as a fund will do every month to try and minimise fraud where we can. The actual triggers, as an example, would be if we had a returned post, and that returned post would obviously then trigger us to make a necessary action by suspending the pension, for example, to try and minimise any risk of fraud there. There's been some general wording updates on the actual policies you'll see there, and some sections have been provided with some examples just to add some extra clarity. The only other really one to mention is the last one on the list with the address tracing for members in the UK. So this really is a main process change in the policy. We did run this previously for all UK pensioners, but under reflection, the new way of thinking is to just instigate this activity now for pensioners or anyone due to retire, within the next 12, 24 months. And we feel this more targeted approach would be a lot more beneficial to the fund to do it in this way. Obviously, we're doing all UK pensioners, people may move several times and things like that. So that's really the main changes to the policy. Just really to make a comment that this has been through internal audit as well, and it's been cross-referenced with their corporate policy, just to make sure, as I say, that the two are aligned with each other. But apart from that, I'm happy to have take any further comments or feedback if you'd like them included. Thank you.
Members, over to you. Any? Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it was only one thing. When I was looking at the policy, it was not clear to me which lines you had changed. So I didn't know whether in future, if we could have had like the new line, say in red, so that we knew what you were putting in or taking out, because I couldn't quite try and marry up what you've said, where that was in the actual policy itself.
Yes, thank you. We'll look at that going forward. I think there's always this balance between, we sometimes try and provide a track change version as well, but on this particular one, it did look quite messy to kind of bring that and present to you. So we'll look at along those lines for next time to actually put that in. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's obviously a really important policy, and it's good to see the work that's been done around it. Just a suggestion from me that, and apologies if I've missed it somewhere in the strategy, but would it be useful to put a link into the cybersecurity and the work that's been done around that? Because, in terms of the way fraud is changing, it's probably the risks arising from cyber fraud are a key area at the moment and are only going to increase in the future.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. We can look into that. Obviously, we've got the section right at the end of the policy with the other relevant links, so we're looking to put in something in there as well.
Andy.
Thank you, Chair. I was just interested on whether there's any reporting that should be part of the policy in terms of what we might be seeing in terms of current threats and fraud, and whether that should be part of the policy, that we should sort of be made aware of the sort of attacks that are going on, the sort of areas that you are finding the most amount of work. Appreciate there's internal and external audit within it, but I wondered if that was something that you could provide. Thank you.
It's something we could look at. I know, Corey, you sometimes have reports through on systems threats, or at least used to, so that's maybe something we could pick up on. In terms of threats within the actual administration service, probably hand that over to Mark, but Corey, if you want to.
Yeah, on the website, we do get reports on any attempted attacks on the website. There haven't been any in the last 12 months on our particular website, but that is the pension funds website. That doesn't include the council's websites and things like that. So we do certainly monitor that. And we are doing the wider piece on cyber security at the moment as well, which should hopefully bring through some more report mechanisms for that.
Yeah, and I think Joe's been undertaking an activity timely because of what's been going on, obviously in Ukraine around contacting our major suppliers. So she's got I think in the cyber report we've got a statement around what they've been doing. At the time we drafted that, we were still waiting a response from West Northampton themselves. So the reality is the majority of the attacks are going to be on the corporate network. And I, my understanding is they happen all the time. It's to some degree there are attempted attacks, but we'll reflect on that because it does seem like a useful activity to bring forward to yourself. But I think, as I say, a lot of it's going to be on the West Northamptonshire system itself, as opposed to, let's say, the hosted server.
Thank you for that. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, I don't like writing policy by committee, but in a similar vein to the previous comment, we'll leave out the link to the fraud policy, maybe a link to the whistleblowing as well. I think it's probably the most relevant policy to link to fraud and corruption.
Yes, noted. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? No. Okay, so the committee is asked to approve the revised Cambridgeshire Pension Fund anti-fraud and corruption policy. Are we happy to do so? Yes, thank you. Okay, so item 9 is the Pension Fund Communication Plan 2022-23. Can I ask Corey Bose, to the Employee Services and Communication Manager, to present the report?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the report's fairly self-explanatory, but I'll just take you through a couple of the highlights. As you'll have seen from the business plan for the next period, the biggest activity we're taking in the communication sphere is a review of the website. So that's going to be going on throughout the year with the digital services team at West Northamptonshire. Very much for the next 12 months, it is just reviewing the offering. There will be consultation with stakeholders in June and October to try and get the member journeys and try and map out the planned improvements with them. And then we would take forward any action for the actual improvements in the following scheme year. So this year is very much about designing that, making sure we've got the website offering right. At the moment, our website is spread across 2 different servers. So we have the employer side of the website, which is hosted locally. The member side of the website is actually hosted as part of our pension administration software. And that was to allow a seamless connection between information about the scheme and the members actually able to log into their own pension account and do certain activities. We do need to review that. There are times that we can't update the website because there are updates happening to the pension administration software, which takes down that front end facing. So we do lose the ability to keep that website up to date, which is one of the main reasons that we're looking at the review, whether to keep them separate or actually to put them both onto one server and just have a link to the part where members can log into their server, into their record, sorry. In other areas for members, our biggest activity this year will be trying to introduce life stage communication. So for example, if someone's reaching into their 50s, we might send them out some information about retirement planning, what their options are, and what they need to start thinking about. If they're partway through their career, that communication might be about increasing their benefits and what options they have for that. For new starters, it can be things like a reminder to transfer in their benefits before the 12-month deadline is up. So we're looking into what would be effective there. I shared an interesting report with the other managers in the service just this week about what retirement means to different people at different ages. So we are really trying to find out what messages would resonate with people at key points in their life cycle. For employee communications, we're focusing on training with employers. So we've got various training activities booked in. The rest of the activity will be around evaluation and communicating that process, particularly towards the end of the year as we finish off those calculations and start that consultation period with employers over their contribution rates. Other than that, I don't have anything else to speak to on the report, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Corey. Any questions, members? Alan.
Thanks, Chair. Just one question, I'll move further away. On page 114, it's looking at member surveys for active members, deferred members. And it's in most months. Is that an ongoing survey or do you do it online or?
So that's an online survey, but it is
Okay.
very much like when you interact with your bank, and then they send you a survey about that interaction. So it's just finding out on a monthly basis how we've performed with members that have actually had some interaction with us.
Members, any other questions, comments? Okay, thank you. So the committee is asked to approve the fund's communication plan for 2022-23. We're happy to do so. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we move on to item 10. Item 10 is the employer's admission and cessations report. I'll ask Corey to present this report as well, please.
Thank you. Again, a fairly straightforward report. I'll just summarise the main takes from it. There are 3 admissions into the fund this time. One of those for Easy Clean is backdated to 2020. This is because they wanted a pass-through agreement and had to wait for some permission from the Department for Education before they could do that. That permission actually wasn't given, so we put a full admission in place for that particular case. The other 2 are for the same company. The reason we've listed them differently is in the first example, there are 4 different admissions actually included there. They had chosen to put a broadly comparable scheme in place for those staff members originally. They closed that scheme in the 31st of March last year, and we put an admission agreement in place immediately to allow that pension protection for the staff that were transferred out from the council previously. On the second case with that company listed, I believe that was an oversight on their part. They hadn't put that in place, and we put an admission agreement backdated, so those memberships were covered from the start of the transfer to that company. On the cessation, there are 6 employers across 7 admission agreements that are ceasing participation in the fund. All of these were pass-through agreements, meaning the liabilities were retained by the letting employer that transferred the staff to them. So there's no exit assessments that need to take place, no deficits to collect, and no exit payments to pay out in those particular cases. I've got nothing else to add to the report.
Thank you, Corey. Members, have you any questions? No, nothing at all. Okay, I assume we're quite happy then to take them all as one. So are we happy to agree the full recommendations are set out on page 119 of the agenda pack? Thank you. Okay, so we come to item 11, which is in order to discuss the following items, we need to move the meeting into private session, excluding the press and public. Members, do you agree with the proposal to move into private session? Thank you. So the committee is asked to resolve that the press and public be excluded from the meeting on the grounds that the following 2 items contain exempt information under paragraph 3 of part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972 as amended, and that it would not be in the public interest for this information to be disclosed information relating to financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the authority holding the information. As this is the final public item on the agenda, I would like to express my thanks to those members of the public and press who have taken the time to watch the meeting today via the council's website. So broadcast will now end. The committee is due to meet next on the 10th of June. This public meeting is now closed.